And at that point, I think when you ask the centurion, he's going to plead the fifth, and he'll say something like, I don't need to fight to prove I'm right. I don't need to fight to prove I'm right. Look, that's the story. We were asleep, they stole the body, into discussion. See, if it's Roman centurions, now the Pentecost story makes sense. They're not in town anymore. Pentecost is not a heavy holiday. There's no reason for them to be around. The priests don't want them around because they don't want them in the temple. And there's really no follow-up. Pilate's satisfied. There's not going to be a revolt. There's no problems in Jerusalem. This story can just go on its way. So the Pharisees, the chief priests, the temple have basically said, by our might, we're going to make this right. We're going to just keep telling this lie. And as Chris Rock says, you just tell the lie till you believe it is truth. That's the way you're a successful liar. You keep telling the lie till you believe it's true. And they just keep telling the lie. Matthew says they told the lie how long? At least 30 years. Because Matthew says when he's writing his gospel that this story has still been spread amongst the Jews even to this day. Stick with the lie. Keep telling the lie. Well, as they continue to tell this story of Jesus resurrected, there are some in the temple who are getting a little frustrated. And they keep bringing the apostles in every once in a while, never accusing them of having stolen a body, mind you, but constantly accusing them of proclaiming this message and this Jesus. And finally, the second time they're brought in, Peter and John, to be flogged, there's a discussion that happens while they're outside in the waiting room. In Acts 5, we find a man by the name of Gamaliel, who basically also says we don't need to fight this to prove it's right. In fact, Gamaliel says it's not our fight. In the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. See, after all the other false messiahs have come and gone, Gamaliel argues, if this is just another crackpot who got a group of followers together and they did steal the body, we have nothing to worry about because eventually it'll be found out and these guys are done. But if it's from God, you'll not be able to stop these men. Not only that, who are you going to be fighting? You're going to find yourself fighting God himself. If it's true that it's a lie, which is not just a story that's been passed on through the days of Matthew's readers, but has been a theory of the resurrection that is thrown out from time to time and is still scoffed at by some as the truth, that really this is a story of delusional men who believed it happened and then made a way to make it happen, then let me ask you this question. Wouldn't you at some point think, if I'm going to die for this lie, there's no sense in it? If I'm one of those disciples who stole the body, wouldn't it be easier just to say, here's where you're going to find the bones? Wouldn't it be easier just to confess to the truth and go, over there, that's where we laid him? You know, so after you're done watching CSI, now you can watch Cold Case, and the weird blonde chick can solve the crime after the time and tell everybody they were right. See, you didn't think primetime TV had anything to do with church, did you? But here's what happened to the 12 apostles. Peter, crucified upside down. James, beheaded by Herod Agrippa. Andrew, tradition says, was crucified in Turkey. Thomas, 4 soldiers ran him through with spears in India. Philip in Hierapolis was put to death by a Roman proconsul. Matthew was stabbed to death probably in Ethiopia. Bartholomew, we're told, was killed in India. James was stoned and then clubbed to death in Jerusalem. Simon the Zealot was killed for refusing to worship the sun god, saying instead, I worship God's son. Matthias, you know, the guy who got so lucky in chapter 1 to become the 12th apostle, was burned to death, probably in Syria. Judas, not that one, the one known as Thaddeus, was executed by the nephew of the king of Syria. And then a 13th guy popped up and said, and lastly he appeared to me. And I became the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul. Paul was beheaded by Nero. And John, the only one to live out his years, lived it after life in exile by the very Roman government that was trying in the late 90s to destroy Christianity. All 13 men died for what they believed to be true. If it's a lie, then fight it. Make it right. But instead, they say there's no reason to fight because what we're doing is right. It's so right, in fact, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write the gospel accounts. Paul tells us the message of the gospel over and over again, especially in the books of Romans and Galatians, and the application to his other letters. They all keep proclaiming that something about Jesus, something about that Sunday morning made the difference. In fact, if you want to summarize Matthew's gospel, I think you can take it from these other who words. The Exodus is here. The happy ones are near. Let's get together. Way back, early on, Matthew begins to quote Old Testament scripture after Old Testament scripture after Old Testament scripture. Matthew says, here's the thing. We're going to quote from a book that's not even part of our religion. We're going to write from a book that stopped being written 400 years ago before our Jesus even showed up on stage. And I'm going to prove to you by the things he did and the things he said and what we know of him that he is the fulfillment of what Judaism says was supposed to happen. These are not the documents that were under the control of the Romans or the Jewish foe or the Christians. These are the documents that are under the control of the Jewish writers. These were written for Jewish people. But Matthew 2, verse 15. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. That's Hosea chapter 13, verse 1. My son in Egypt is clearly there, a reference to the events of the Passover. The events where God called out his people from the culture of Egypt and made them a nation unto himself. And Matthew says, here's what Jesus did. Jesus called unto himself his own people out of this world to create a new nation. The nation which God has wanted to have from the very beginning. See, this is the Exodus. This is the event where every person who finds themselves in wrong with God can make it right. Not by their fight, but because Christ didn't fight. Which was exemplified in his followers who proclaimed the message to be true by sacrificing their lives for the truth of the message the same way Jesus did. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, they all write for this very reason, to encourage people to join the happy. Get together with the truth of the message of the gospel. And now it's time to wrap up. The tomb is empty. Theories have been suggested. But the evidence weighs much stronger on the fact that what happened is the original story. Oh, there are a bunch of stories floating out there. We've got some questionable witnesses. Some who claim stuff they could have never seen. We've got some sketchy bank accounts over here. And we have some people who clearly had a motive and an agenda. They wanted not only to eliminate this man, they wanted to make sure that he could never cause problems again. And the fact is, within a few decades, the world's turned upside down by the ones he leaves. 2 millennia later, the world is still being transformed by the proclamation of this message. And I can only conclude that the reason is because it's true.